Hey everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Today on the show, I am talking to the host of the Sons of Patriarchy podcast, Peter Bell. I connected with Peter right before the show was about to launch. We got connected through a mutual friend, Sarah Stankorb, who is an incredible journalist and the author of Disobedient Women. I've also had her on the show in the past and really respect and value her opinion. And so when she said I needed to talk to Peter, I definitely set up a call as quickly as possible. And really, we had a conversation for about an hour or so just talking shop. I shared some of my experience doing a podcast about religious abuse, what that was like, what he should expect. He already had some experience in the podcasting world, so we just kind of talk shop for about an hour, and that's really what today's conversation is as well. We're just two content creators tackling the issue of religious abuse. For myself, I started with the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement and kind of widened my gaze a little bit to look at fundamentalist religion as a whole. And Peter is focused on the CREC and the teachings of people like Doug Wilson.
The world is flammable. Everything catches fire these days. All you have to do is say something like white babies or something like men shouldn't have sex with unstable women. Things that would have gone past without comment in a saner time.
Who Sarah also exposed in a Vice article many years ago. And so I am really excited to have this conversation kind of in the public forum and let you guys get a sneak peek into our discussion, talking about the quibbles people have with our shows, just based on little things like the sound of our voices. We talk about the response of Christian leadership to podcasts that expose abuse in Christian churches and so much more. I really think you're going to enjoy the conversation. But first, I try not to do a lot of, ahead of the show conversation before getting into a topic, but I do have one housekeeping thing I want to talk about. I've had a couple people reach out to me that are saying that their feeds for this podcast are not updating. I know a large portion of you listen on YouTube or watch on YouTube, and then there's many of you that listen on Spotify, Apple, and things like that. As far as I know, the Spotify feeds and the Apple feeds for the Preacher Boys podcast are publishing normally. But wherever you listen to the show, obviously YouTube's a different story, but if you listen to the audio version of the show, if you support the show by subscribing anywhere on CastBox, on Spotify, on Apple, on Pocket Casts, please go to that feed and check to make sure that it is updated. One of the people reached out to me and said that their feed hasn't updated since January, which is a big concern because it's March 11th and I've been releasing episodes consistently and didn't stop in January. So just please take a second right now. If you've ever gotten value from the show, please do me a huge favor. Go to your podcast player of choice. Make sure you're subscribed to the Preacher Boys podcast and make sure that the latest uploads are downloading. If they're not, please send me an email at preacherboysdoc@gmail.com or connect with me on social media and let me know so I can address those issues on those specific platforms. But anyway, we have a really good conversation lined up today. And, I think my biggest takeaway from the conversation is just how busy me and Peter are and how stressful doing the podcast can be. And that's why I'm really thankful for my friends over at Magic Mind. They just sent me a package of just free product, which I've said this before. There's a lot of companies that I have worked with or that I've become friends with over the years doing podcasts. And the company I bug the most is Magic Mind. They're one of my absolute favorite companies that I've worked with since starting the show. And they create these really amazing energy shots, which I've talked about on the show before, that are filled with natural ingredients like ashwagandha, lion's mane, and so much more. And these shots make it really easy and tasty to get all the things that you need to start your day. It's a great way to supplement your coffee or to add to your coffee. So they're fantastic. But they're just now launching their gummy format. So it's everything really that's in the shot, but without caffeine in the form of a gummy. And this literally means that kids as young as 8 can take this and, all the way up through adulthood. But these are really fantastic. I've tried a couple of them. They give me some samples in the past, but they just sent me this like massive pack in the mail the other day, which I'm very appreciative of. So, they're really good. If you guys want to check them out yourself, you can head over to magicmind.com/boysgm. That's magicmind.com/boysgm and use the code BOYS25 for 25% off of your purchase. Again, these are absolutely fantastic. I shouldn't have popped on my mouth before I tried to read the ad. But if you had these in your hand, you would also be eating them yourself because they're that good. And you can take a couple of them at a time. You could take up to 3, according to the package. So I'm just going to take a couple more here. I know it's hard to understand me now, but remember, I'll put this on the screen. Head over to magicmind.com/BOYSGM. Use the code BOYS25. 25% off your order.
All right. So we've got another guest, just like we've been doing for the last few episodes, crossing over with some like-minded podcasters and like-minded podcasts who are touching on church abuse and clergy abuse in different circles. We're doing the Reformed in Doug Wilson circles, although it spreads further than that. And we've got somebody who's doing it in another realm. So if you can introduce yourself, introduce your series, and we'll go on from there.
Yeah, my name is Eric Skwarczynski, and I started a podcast called Preacher Boys in January of 2020. Really started out documenting solely abuse within independent fundamental Baptist churches, which is a denomination, although they would deny that, it's a denomination of extremely conservative, King James only Baptist conservative. So it's a relatively small denomination. I think the Huffington Post once said it was like 1% of the U.S. population, but 1% of that population is still pretty sizable. And within that percentage, there are a ton of people who have been abused and a lot of leadership that has abused and been covered up for. And so I started reporting on that through the show, interviewing survivors, similarly to what you're doing with your show in the Doug Wilson kind of circle. And over the years, I've just come across more and more stories and have noticed that, there's people in the Southern Baptist Convention that have had similar experiences. There's people in other evangelical sects that have had similar experiences. And so now my horizon has really broadened to cover just abuse in religious fundamentalist environments and what contributes to that being able to happen and, contributes to people being able to get away with it. And so I've been doing that show since 2020, was also in a documentary series called Let Us Pray, A Ministry of Scandals on HBO Max, and just trying to get the word out as much as I can.
We were introduced by Sarah Stainkorb, who sort of first broke the news, at least publicly, on a wider platform about Doug and about some of the abuse that was happening in churches. The CREC, yours is the IFB, ours is the CREC, so the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, and yours is Independent Fundamentalist Baptist. Is that right?
Yeah, Independent Fundamental Baptist. Yep.
What got you into this is this is not something that most dudes do, is talk about church abuse.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the long story short, when I was a staff kid, I was born and raised in this Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, and around the time I was getting out of 10th grade, getting ready to go into 11th grade, a man relocated to our church who had abused a teenage girl at his prior church. The only way that I found out about this is because I happened to Google his name when he showed up and saw that there was a warrant out for his arrest. And long story short, I started getting really concerned about that, going to the leadership, going to parents, going to youth pastor. And fast forward to about 2-3 years ago, almost a decade later, he was still volunteering at the church and still there, and I was not. So gives you kind of a picture of what happened there. And I go into detail a couple times on my show. The reason I started the show specifically was not that specific instance, though that certainly colored my view of the faith I'd grown up in and, the independent fundamental Baptist world at large. What really prompted me to start the show is back in 2019, there was a story that just looked extremely similar to the one I had encountered as a teenager. And the only difference was with this story is that at that time there were pastors tweeting, raising support and for the legal fund for the man who had abused a girl in his church. And so they were sending out on church letterhead, they were tweeting, they were saying, hey, he's being falsely attacked, all these sorts of things. And it really frustrated me. And so I sat in my car in front of my apartment, recorded a quick live video saying, if you're associated with this ministry, this ministry, this ministry, this ministry, you need to leave your church right now. And kind of this explosive, just angry, like, this sucks. It's been happening for years. I'm fed up with it, and I have to say something about it. I've been waiting for somebody to cover this in some kind of way, but I guess that's not going to happen. So let's talk about it. And then I announced working on a project and had like 20 people reach out and thought probably a podcast is going to be the best way to cover this. And so I just started doing interviews consistently and haven't stopped having people reach out to me. So I'm still doing it. So that's kind of the like 10,000-foot view of a pretty fast paced process, tied into a lot of personal interaction with this stuff.
People have asked us, what is the CREC? And so maybe I'll ask you, like, what is the IFB? If people have never heard, I mean, people might have heard of the SBC. It's like, is it similar to this? What is the IFB? And I know you started there. Now you're more general with abuse in religious contexts and some of these and why this happened. So what even is it?
Yeah. So the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement is for reference point for somebody who's never encountered it, but they're familiar with a larger denomination like the Southern Baptist Convention. It's very similar in many ways. Women are not allowed to be ordained. The restrictions on women in general is pretty strong, heavily complementarian. But they go a step further than those denominations in many different areas. So instead of being, biblical literalists, they are biblical literalists who believe that only the 1611 King James Version is the inspired and preserved Word of God. They are, literal 7-day creationists, which is fairly common. They're, Kirk Cameron Christians, so they've got the pre-trib, left behind kind of theology. But then beyond that, I would say the hallmark of IFB churches is an overwhelming amount of control over every area. When it comes to the music you listen to, anything that has a breathy or rock type sound is not permitted. Even the Gaithers were frowned upon by many in our denomination, which is a obviously very conservative music group. We weren't allowed to go to movie theaters, weren't allowed to dance, weren't allowed to drink. There was many different layers of that. And I think beyond that, I think there was a real push for people to dedicate their entire lives to the cause of that denomination. It was not rare to hear pastors give the illustration that, I haven't shared that. I don't think I've ever shared this on the podcast before, but there was a sermon illustration I heard a ton growing up where they would say, have you ever passed a vending machine and you want to get a drink and it's sold out? It has nothing to give anybody. And they would say, as a Christian, as a Baptist, you need to have a sign around your neck that says, I am sold out. Like I have nothing left to give to the world, nothing left to give to anybody else except for the cause. And that was really defining, I think, of my experience was that, no matter how committed you were, no matter how many ministries you served in, it was always give us more, give us more, give us more, and push this bus forward. And that was really the drive, and the mentality was like, I'm going to give everything to this organization. It was a really, really controlling, really restrictive environment. And I'm going to say one more thing on that. I was listening again to your interview with Tia Levings that dropped recently.
Yep. You just had her on too recently as well.
Yeah. And I have her coming back on in a couple weeks. So love the stuff she shares. And one of the things that she mentioned in the interview was that they spent a lot of time splitting hairs over theology, splitting hairs over whether they were doing things correctly. And she said that it was easy to confuse that with critical thinking.
Yes.
And I think that feeling of splitting hairs over every aspect of your life and thinking that means you're being critical and you're thinking that means you know what you believe really represents such a swath of my existence where it was like, I'm constantly stressed about going to hell. I'm constantly in tears at the altar. I'm constantly doing more ministries, constantly serving in more ways. And I thought that meant that I was choosing to do those things. But instead, it was all fueled by pressure, fear, anxiety that was being placed on me by a very specific, mandate from the people that were higher on the ladder than I was.
Yeah, that's why I was so intrigued by Preacher Boys, and we have been tagged on so many stinking posts as
I
like, oh,
know.
you got to listen to Preacher Boys, you got to listen to Sons of Patriarchy.
I made
And a
an
lot of it has to
exodus
do
from
with
X, and
yeah,
I
X
went
and
back in the
Facebook.
other day and
Yeah.
saw, oh, tag, 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 tag. I was like,
Yeah.
I don't want to be on X, but I guess we're both popular in
Yeah,
tags and posts there.
yeah, but a lot of it revolves around like it's the way you describe IFB circles is how I've heard described. I've never been part of a CRAC church. I've been in the OPC and the PC and Reformed denominations, if people know what those
No.
are. But it tends to revolve around the same thing. It's like your life does revolve around this, that you're constantly doing more, and not just constantly doing more, being told you need to be doing more.
Yeah.
And
The
at least in
moving
the
goalpost.
CRAC,
Yeah.
yeah, move the goalposts. But there's a nefariousness or a there's more all-encompassing stuff to do, at least in the circles that we're exposing, Doug Wilson circles, where he's created a media empire, which I'm not aware of. Maybe you're far more aware of IFB circles than I am, but he's created a media empire. He's created a publishing house. He's created a classical school curriculum. So you don't have to get out of these circles, but you're
Yep.
also told to stay in these circles. This is safe. This is God honoring. You need to classically educate your kids. You need to have as many kids as possible. The woman has to do so many things. The man has to do different, but so many things.
Yeah. It's so
all
similar.
consuming.
Yeah, and it's funny because like this is why I have had more conversations that go a little bit broader, is that, you know, and using Tia Levings as an example again, like she went from IFB adjacent circles. Well, she went from like evangelical to IFB to kind of SBC to
Yep.
Reformed, and there's minute differences between
there's-
those experiences.
There'd be
And
like theological differences between them.
yeah, and even those, when you really get into the practical theology, very similar. Like the structure of it, the way that women are treated, like all that stuff is very similar. But yeah, theology was such a staunch thing. Like most people in my denomination would have looked at a Calvinist and said, like, you might be a Christian. I mean, we would have looked at, I mean, some Christians look at Doug Wilson's, yeah, but
I'm about to say it's like it goes the other way too. All these Reformed people is like look at independent fundamental Baptists or Armenians or whatever it is like there might be a room for you in heaven, but
right,
there's a waiting list.
And we had the restricted, we had the media empires too. You know, like our denomination was very heavily invested in building colleges, and so you had, West Coast Baptist College and Golden State Baptist College in California. You had Bob Jones, University, which is probably the most publicly well-known in Greenville, South Carolina. You had Hyles Anderson College, which was one of the, flagship IFB colleges in Hammond, Indiana, which was one of the biggest mega churches in the country for a long time, ran, dozens and dozens of buses into Chicago every single week and brought in kids to the church, largest Sunday school in America. I think it was Christianity Today ran that story back in the 50s or 60s. And so there was all of that. And then on top of that, because it was education group focused, we had the curriculum like Abeka, we had Bob Jones curriculum. And so everybody, although we were independent, which is the biggest misnomer ever, we all used the same curriculum. We all went to the same Bible colleges. Our pastors all graduated from the same colleges, were inspired by the same pastors. The only difference is, and it's why reporting on the IFB is incredibly hard for someone who's not been in it, is that we don't have decades of logs of here's who was in leadership at such and such a time. We don't have the SBC.
There's no central leadership to kind of give you all that stuff.
Right. Like the people in it know, but we don't have like the SBC where it's like, pull up the meeting, the record from this meeting in 1974. It's like, there's varied versions of IFB history that depend on who you think was the leading pastor in such and such a decade. It's really messy. But it leads to some interesting conversation at least,
Yeah. I'm curious too. So you did the live video talking about the ministries, if you're part of this ministry and that ministry and this ministry, then you started hearing from people. When did you realize like, oh, the abuse here is even worse than I thought on the front end? And you're like, I've got more to go through on this series, or more stories than I ever thought was possible. Because we have that for Sons of Patriarchy, and I'm curious for for preacher boys, and we were like, there's more than anybody knows in these circles.
It's a weird question to answer because I won't mention Tia Lovings again after this, but I was literally just talking to her, and
yeah, it's just the closest to mind. Yep.
yeah, and she just says things better than me, so it's easier to sometimes, just refer to some of the things that we talked about.
Extraordinarily well spoken. Yeah.
Yeah, but one of the things I think we had talked about in a prior interview was I said something like evangelicals are now saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
And she kind of took me to task for it in a very loving Tia way, but was like, they've been saying that, and I kind of corrected myself and said, well, they're saying it now in the public sphere, some of the talking points. And I guess that's like when it comes to the thing of like discussion around shock or, are you surprised? I don't know what word to describe when a news story breaks, but it's not shock. Like I rarely hear stories now.
At least not anymore. Yeah. Same for me.
Yeah. And honestly, like, because I had sat with this like internal thought, and like I studied the IFB for a long time before actually starting a podcast, most of those bubbles had already burst. And I think because I was at such a formative age when I first came across a story of abuse, it painted like my church was my world. It was the religion, and so when that burst, that was the pain of feeling like, oh, this is all really bad, because I saw the reaction of the people responding to it. And then you immediately start looking into your movement and seeing what had been reported thus far. And again, by the time I got to the show, it's like, I already know this is really bad. And now it just feels like this is affirming like, oh, I wasn't wrong. Like, this is as bad as I thought. Now that's not to say like there are certain details of stories that have shocked me or horrified me in ways that like I couldn't have anticipated. I couldn't anticipate the mental toll of the volume of stories, but I don't know. Like it's such a weird, like I was shocked how many people were willing to share their story more than I was shocked at the amount of stories that existed. Like, I guess that's kind of like the differentiator there. I gotta ask you a question though, because I'm curious, and I know we talked a little bit after Sarah introduced us. Actually talked a lot because I talk a lot. But
okay. I needed it.
What was your draw to covering the CREC as an outsider to it? Because for me, the IFB roots are always going to be in the show. Like I saw this so closely. For you, did you see something similar, or was it something where you were like, I just see this as a big story and nobody's really consistently reporting on it?
Yeah, a lot of it. So it's personal in the sense, not in the sense that I was ever part of a CRAC. That's not part of my story. But I was trained as a Reformed pastor. I was trained towards the Reformed ministry.
Yeah.
I went to Westminster Seminary, California, got my master's degree there. And so I was moving in Reformed circles towards ordination. And the CREC bills themselves as a Reformed denomination. And there's a long history with them and the rest of Reformed denominations. Like, hey, you're not really part of us because you're heretical. And yes, there's parts of that that's true, but there's also like, but there's so much overlap in some of these denominations, especially culturally. There is a lot of overlap, and theologically too. There's a lot of overlap, but it didn't really strike me. I had an internship in Eastern Washington, and I think I've only said this once during the series when I was talking to Mike Cosper from Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, I think. But I had an internship in Eastern Washington, and the church was something like 2 hours away from Christchurch, Moscow.
Okay.
And the nature of the church and where we were situated and the people who were part of it, it was kind of unofficially known as like a safe haven from one of the CREC churches. And there was one, I think, in the same city. And so we had people who had come from that church and were at the church that I was at for the internship. Part of that internship was also was preaching, but it was home visits and getting to know people within the congregation and asking about their lives and just being part of it. which was one of the best parts of that internship. I really did enjoy it. This is a few years ago. But people, I was asked the question, hey, have you heard of the CRAC? And I won't say who the person is because they've asked me to remain anonymous. And I said, yeah, I've heard a little bit about them. The only thing I'd heard is like, oh, they're just bad theologically. That's the extent of my knowledge. And they asked me, have you heard about other things? And I was like, what other things are you talking about? And they said, have you heard about abuse? And I was like, I mean, to be honest, I've never like looked into or heard about abuse in any church circles at all. Partially, I was kind of blind to it and not aware of it. Even though it'd been going around me, I'm assuming I was at Mars Hill in not in Seattle, but in Orange County. And so I knew some stuff on the back end on kind of on the ground level that people outside of Mars Hill didn't know. And that fed a little bit of this too. But I heard this woman's story about her abuse, not at the hands of the elders, but how it was handled by the elders. After that, I looked up abuse at Christ Church. I distinctly remember sitting in the office at the church office and typing in abuse Christ Church Moscow and seeing a few stories that had been made public in 2015, 2017-ish, and then 2020. And then Steenkorp's article came out that fall. So this is summer of 2021. Steenkorp's article in Vice came out fall of 2021. I was like, I don't know if you curse on Preacher Boys, but
sometimes it's appropriate. Sometimes
I was like, holy shit, there's so much abuse that's going on here.
Yeah.
And feel free to, I'll edit this, or if you want to edit this too. But I saw like, this is really bad. And we've been warned about some of this stuff in seminary, which I think I'm still a Christian. I thank God that I was warned about abuse in the church in my seminary training. And they did the right thing. So you talk to authorities, you talk to anybody that you can the second you hear about any type of abuse that's happening in these circles. So that was my first kind of run-in with this. And it was because I'd actually talked to the person who had been abused. And I never talked to somebody who had been abused to the extent that she had, and then how it was handled by the elders, who's like, hey, you're being abused because you're not having enough sex with your husband, and you are being too opinionated, or you're being too controlling, or you're emasculating him. You need to be more submissive towards your husband. And I was like, am I hearing you right? That when you came to the leadership, that you were being abused, that they blamed you for your abuse and not the person who was abusing you. And I didn't see her story anywhere. I was like, if I haven't seen her, if I can't find her story and it's not been made public, I'm not abuse informed. I didn't know any of the statistics, but I was like, if I haven't heard hers, I wonder who else I haven't heard.
Right. Yeah.
In these circles. And that got me down. I was like, this is really bad. And in the circles that I was looking at, and they were adjacent enough to the circles I was already in. I had an understanding of like their theological system, of their cultural system, of their views on humanity, on the world, on God, on scripture, on male-female relations. It was within my circles enough to where I was like, I think there's something here, and I think I can speak to this.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you resonate with this, but I'll throw it out there and see, see if you do. But one of the things that's been challenging to me, in examining the faith that I did hold on to, and was raised in, is there's a lot of times, especially I would say from the time that I left my childhood church and like the next 5 to 6 years, the faith that I was taking in and the understanding I had of the Bible and of the teachings of Jesus was leading me to drastically different places than where the Doug Wilsons of the world seem to end up. But I also feel like that was it kind of served as a filter from like understanding how sinister some of the writings of some of these leaders were, because I interpreted it with the most positive possible interpretation. And the perfect example of this is one of the books that I devoured of Doug Wilson's that I recommended a million times. And sorry to anybody I recommended.
Yeah, you've
this
read more
book
Doug
to.
Wilson than I have. I'm impressed.
Well, I read his book, Heaven Misplaced, which is a very small book,
Yeah.
but I thought was a very beautiful book at the time because the whole book is really this post-millennial theology and this idea of, we're so focused on heaven and like heaven being our home and we're so excited about heaven. But the whole idea of the book is like, how do we bring God's kingdom here?
Yeah.
And when I read that at 20 years old, I think I was when I read it, I thought that is incredible. And I associated that with, okay, this is me working with this orphanage, and this is me serving the fatherless and the widows, and this is us being able to build hospitals and like, and
your ideas of bringing the kingdom of God into the book rather than what
right,
the book
like
meant.
It was like, man, God's kingdom is going to be this utopia, and the verse that I still think about all the time, but the verse that I loved in scripture was there was this verse where it was saying that, Satan's been defeated. I'm paraphrasing. Satan's been defeated, but now we get to trample his strongholds underfoot. And this concept that, and I'll find the verse in a second, but this concept that like, hey, the big bad is destroyed, and now we get to do the fun work of like, hey, the main battle's over. Now we get to stomp out poverty. Now we get to stomp out fatherlessness. Now we get to stomp out all these horrible things that have plagued our world as a result of sin. I would have said at that time. It's like, that's beautiful. And not having the IFB mentality I'd been raised in, where it's like, this world is not my home. I'm just passing through and I'll fly away. And when the roll is called at beyonder, I'll be there. It was like, no, we can bring God's kingdom here. But again, my view of God's kingdom, like you said, looked very differently than, antebellum slavery was one of the most peaceful times in our history. And that's what God's kingdom could look like. It's like, that was way different, but I never picked up on those themes that were so sinister because I had a optimism about like, hey, we all agree that, loving each other is probably a good thing, right?
That's been fun to help people understand some of Doug's writings and his works, because they're sometimes intentionally not obtuse, but they're intentionally vague in some of the application to where it, like, he kind of allows or invites you to inject your own worldview or whatever it may be into it, and so it seems less sinister when you first bring him in, and then that's how he gets into your life and seeps in and says, no, that's not what I actually mean. I mean, slavery wasn't that bad. I mean, women should submit to all men everywhere, that men should rule the world, that we have to repeal the 19th Amendment, that we have to make all the nations Christians. So it kind of comes into you after your initial, like, well, he's not that bad. He's just like a kind little grandpa. And then he's like, I gotcha. And then he starts injecting himself into you.
Well, Sarah McCammon, who I don't know if you've interviewed her for your show or if you plan to.
I haven't heard of her.
She wrote a book. She wrote a book called The Evangelicals.
I've seen that.
And she's the NPR political correspondent and the co-host of the NPR Politics podcast, which she's a former evangelical. And so she's had a lot to write about, obviously, over the last couple of years. And one of the things that a phrase that she used that has stuck with me in our conversation is she said, she was referencing Trump at the time, but this is perfectly apt for what you're describing with Wilson, is she said, it's implausible deniability. He says something that is so incredibly crazy that the instant defense is, he didn't mean that. And you see that when it comes to Doug Wilson saying something about like slavery, where he says in this flowery way, where it's like, he didn't mean the things that actually happened during that period. Or when you hear John Piper say, a woman should endure being smacked, by her abusive husband, well, he doesn't mean that, but it's like, they're straight up saying these things. And I think because we don't think in a sinister way, at least I would hope that people
use what he or they say and say like, well, they said it. They kind of opened the door, and I'm just going to walk right through that door.
Right. He really means the good thing that I'm interpreting it to mean, and not the thing he verbatim said, you know, or it's like, that's the approach. And so I don't know. It's always interesting, like hearing people, like their context and approaching the material determines how much of it they take in. And, you know, even Mark Driscoll's a great example, like going from the independent Baptist world and the preaching from that environment. Like the first thing I would tell people when I started listening to Mark Driscoll is like, he's amazing. I've never heard someone preach like him before. He is so kind and gentle. That was my take on Mark Driscoll, because I came from a far more severe preaching style than Driscoll had. You're like, wait a minute.
Sure about that?
Wait a minute. Do you know about Mark Driscoll? No.
Yeah. That's, which is also, we've heard that in the CRAC circles where people will come. We've had people come on the series who've come from IFB circles into the CRAC, and like, it's so open, it's so liberating. I can go to theaters, I can smoke. And then they realize, like, oh, it's the same thing, just in different cloaks. They use different rules, they use different standards, and the same thing is still expected of me, although there's more like liberative use of whatever it is that my vice may be, or whatever it is. It's so interesting that I've heard that more recently.
Same toxic environment, just a different font,
same
basically.
Toxic environment, just different ways of doing it, or different ways of experiencing it. And you said this like 10 or 15 minutes ago, and this struck home for me. So I've never been abused in these circles, and I mean, as far as I know, you've never been abused or sexually abused in these circles. But hearing some of these stories and talking to so many people, that does some stuff to you as a human being, as a person who hears these from other people. After having done this for 5 years, and I've been recording for about a year, but the show's only been alive for coming up on 4 months. What does talking to all these people do to you as the one who's interviewing? Because we'll talk rightly so about what it does to those who are abused, but for those of us who have so many conversations, what, like, maybe bring people into the mind of what's it like listening to hundreds of these stories and then producing them?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. And no, I never was abused, especially not by clergy. I had one situation where there was a very inappropriate interaction with somebody, that I've shared very briefly on the show. But it's something that, like, again, I personally feel like I have some closure over at this point, and it's been talked about to the people it needs to be. In terms of hearing people's stories, and I say that to say, I don't consider myself a survivor. I don't compare myself to these other stories. You know, and I look at some of these people, and it's a miracle to me that they're able to walk through the day, you know, with the things that they've experienced. Honestly, when we talk about like things we expected starting the show, like the biggest mistake I made early on is that I didn't schedule out my time to separate and give myself time to take a second from these conversations. The way I started the podcast, was I set up a Calendly link. I just blocked out a big chunk and said, schedule a time. And I would have 3 interviews in a row, and some of those would be 2 hours, and, you know, some would be extremely heavy, and even more so than others. And a couple of months into doing the show, you know, I found myself like, you're sitting in the car in a parking lot of a store and you start crying, or you're out for a walk and you feel overwhelmed or anxious, or you're sitting inside and you feel suffocated, or you're sitting at the dinner table and it's like, you know, you feel this like very heavy weight. And, you know, and I've had to really learn to manage absorbing those stories, because there are, I mean, and I know, you know, this because you've been doing this, like recording for the last year, is that what you can say once you get to the podcast and what can be shared is usually like 30% maybe of everything that the person tells you, or everything that you know is happening, or all the context you might have. And so I think the heaviest thing doing the show is like, and it's hard to regulate like this feeling of, I know how bad it is, and I know it's even worse than how bad I know it is.
Yep.
And everybody else around me only thinks it's this bad. And like, how do I communicate the weight that I'm feeling about this to people?
And we're only hearing the tip of the spear of some of these
Yeah,
stories.
and
there's so many more out there.
And like, that's such a weird. I was telling somebody the other day, I said, it's have you ever seen the movie Spotlight with us about the Boston Globe
Yes,
reporting on the Catholic
I
Church?
have. Yes. Yep.
There's a scene in there. I was kind of laughing. So I came out of the office, my hair was all crazy, and I was telling my wife about all this stuff, and like I was like, I just need a big bulletin board of like all these things happening. And and she's like, you look insane. And I said, I feel like the scene in Spotlight where Stanley Tucci's sitting on the bench with Mark Ruffalo, and he's like, I'm not crazy. I'm not paranoid. I'm experienced.
Mitch, are you telling me that the Catholic Church removed legal documents from that courthouse? Look, I'm not crazy. I'm not paranoid. I'm experienced. Check the docket. You'll see. They control everything.
I feel that a lot, where it's like, I have to check myself and be like, am I getting a little tinfoil hat here? Like, is this too crazy? Like, am I too lost in my own sauce here? And then you take a step back, you have one more call with the survivor, and you're like, oh, it's worse than that. It's like, it's such a mind warping thing. And I don't think there's any way to do this where it doesn't affect you in a negative way. Like you can do it in a healthier way, but you're still smoking the cigarettes, like it's kind of, it's like you can smoke less, but it's still, every story hurts. And you're
just getting a lot of secondhand smoke, and you can't really help it.
Yeah, it's like a secondhand trauma, but also not comparative at all. So then you feel guilty for feeling like that. It's a mess, like it's because like when I start feeling like, oh, this is so heavy, then it's like, come on, Eric, you didn't even go through it. Like, it's such a weird mental game all the time. And it's why I like talking to people like yourself, or people like a Sarah Stankorb, who does a lot of interviews, is like, it's a uniquely frustrating thing to do. And I don't think people really understand, how much, I don't know, how heavy it is. I know it's rambly, but like, that's how I feel about it. It's like, it's such a mismatched group of thoughts of like, it's really hard, but also I don't want to admit that it's hard because I don't have a right to do that, versus the people who've actually experienced, it's such a weird, it's a weird thing.
I feel bad when I vent. I'm like, I'm not the one who this happened to. I'm just the one who hears about when it happens to somebody else.
Yeah.
And when
you feel dumb. You're like, I heard somebody's experience, and that was really hard for me. But it also, it's like, it is, like, there's a reason trauma therapists go to therapy, it's like, it's all the same. So, anyway.
Another one too, because there's a few differences, and there's a ton of similarities between what we do. And one difference is, you've left the faith and I'm still in the faith.
Yeah. Let's fight. Let's debate.
I'm more curious about, doing a series on abuse in the church and the IFB circles and religious trauma as a non-believer. For those that you talk to and yourself, like what are some of your thoughts coming into these interviews and talking about faith from somebody who doesn't have the faith?
I mean, the fact that I did helps me have the context where like I can empathize still. The weirdest thing now is like, I've just been out of it. I've been out of in like fundamentalist circles for so long, like almost a decade, where it's like, sometimes when I'm like covering a story, I have to like mentally put myself back in my shoes and be like, how would I have analyzed this at that time? And like, what's the perspective that I would have? But like, honestly, I think the biggest difference, like now coming at it from and I started the show still holding on to some faith, and now I don't. Nope. So, but I think my approach is kind of the same. It's like, this is an injustice, and it's a violation of people who do believe this, know? And so,
regardless if you're a Christian or not, this is still bad.
Yeah. Like, I still believe spiritual abuse is a thing. Yeah. And very simply put, regardless of whether or not, someone's faith is like whether or not someone's object of their faith is real, the fact that they have faith in that thing puts them in a uniquely vulnerable position if somebody wants to leverage that against them. And so I still think it's incredibly violating for somebody in the clergy to leverage someone's faith against them to harm them. And I hold to that view as someone who doesn't hold to any particular faith at this point. So I don't think it puts me as far outside the sphere as some people would claim. But I will say the frustrating part is that, now I think it's given a lot of pastors a reason to write off what I'm saying, because you're just attacking the church or you're just this.
The same thing we get, even though I'm a Christian.
Yeah, exactly. And I was going to say what's frustrating about that is like those same pastors, when I was a Christian, would say, well, you're not really a Christian or you're harming so like, again, same thing, different font. And it's like, I've just come to a point now where I'm like, no matter what I do, the point is people don't like the Band-Aid I'm pulling at. And so, whatever thing that I call myself, they're still going to have an issue with it. And they're going to find like, if I tomorrow said, I have converted back to Christianity, I'm going to seminary, I'm becoming a pastor, I'm going to change this from within, the pastors who want to perpetuate abuse would still find some reason, the color of the carpet in my church, the type of music I play, to disregard the actual problem at hand.
Yeah, and we'll look at Sons of Patriarchy. It's run by somebody who's seminary trained, was going to be a pastor, who's still in these circles, and they're like, well, it's really not that bad, or you're just trying to give us a black guy. I was like, no, you already have a black guy, and I'm trying to show where that is to people who are...
You are a preacher boy. We should switch names. I think that would be... we can just do a name swap,
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, last few from me, and feel free to ask anything on your end too. When it comes to maybe some, you've already said some of this, some potential misconceptions about what it is that you do.
Mm-hmm.
What do you hear most often? You're like, that's just not true, based off of what we're talking about, based off what we're exposing. The thing that you hear most consistently, like, hey, let me correct the record for what you think is happening, or what you think is what I'm trying to do. Here's what I'm actually doing.
I mean, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but like the biggest accusation that comes my way is that I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel for stories. Okay. I'll put out a story and someone will say, wow, now we're really digging down to find something, or and again, it's just a catch-all distraction from what I'm talking about. The truth is, again, I'm making difficult decisions on what story can I get out this week. Of these 10 things that happened, which one do I cover? What gets to be an Instagram post versus which gets to be an episode, and what survivor can I talk to and what survivor can't, all that sort of thing. Not to mention the people that reach out who I redirect to law enforcement or a lawyer because they're not ready to go on a public platform. They need to go report it or go to law enforcement, which there's been dozens of those. So like, that's the biggest frustrating one, is like, oh, you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel for stories. And another silly way that this presents itself, where again, they're going to criticize either way, is when I was heavily focused on just IFB and I didn't touch anything outside of that ever. It was, why do you focus on the IFB? You just have a vendetta against it. And then I would cover church outside that denomination, and it would be like, why are you just going after the church? Why don't you talk about Hollywood? And then I covered Harvey Weinstein when that happened and drew parallels to how dangerous abuse is. Well, why are you grouping us in with it was like, come on, like, and then it would go all the way back to, I thought you were focused on the IFB. Guess you ran out of stories and now you're covering this. So it's like, whatever you do, people aren't going to be happy. And I think if I can imagine, I think the struggle that you probably face that's similar to me is that
it's 100% the same thing.
Well, and you're dealing with it as, from a religious perspective.
Yeah.
I know that gets called into question, but then also you are interviewing people who are all across that gamut. Like Sarah Stancorp is as far as I believe, doesn't affiliate with any faith, but she's
she's atheist, agnostic. Yep.
Observer. T.L. Evans is obviously, very critical of fundamentalist groups, and I
We've
think many,
interviewed the broad spectrum. That was
yeah,
intentional too.
yeah, I'm sure you get the feedback of, why don't you interview Christian voices in this
Oh my
versus,
gosh.
scraping the bottom of the barrel for guests, which,
Yeah, we get the same thing. You're just a leftist.
yeah,
Progressive is going after the conservative churches. Like, I don't think you realize I'm still in a conservative denomination.
yeah,
I'm still quote unquote bought into some of these things, even though I hold slightly different interpretations on them and that stuff. But and we get the same thing where it's like, we must have run out of CREC stories because you're now going after
yeah,
all these other reform denominations. Like, no, it's like there's a reason why we not left. It was a reason why we've pivoted.
yeah,
And then we're going back at some points, whether it be for legal reasons, whether it be for still have long conversations that we have to have with people. Or when we go to other denominations, like, well, there's only a few of those bad churches, and why are you so focusing on them? You should be focusing on the ones that
yeah,
really have it. Like, why not go after the main line? And they're transing kids, and they got drag queen story hour, and why aren't you going after that stuff? I was like, because that's just not the point of what we're trying we're trying to expose. Or people who are, I haven't gotten the you're too Christian yet, which is nice. But I have gotten the you're a tool of Satan, you're a leftist scumbag, you're all that stuff.
yeah,
Even though I'm like, do you like even know some of this like that?
yeah,
I still hold to some of the core Christian tenets,
right.
which is so interesting. But yeah, it's the same feedback you get on pivoting or focus on this or don't focus on that or you're scraping the barrel is, I'm assuming that's pretty broad spectrum for podcasts that go after the stuff that we go after.
Yeah, I would say so. And I would say, like, the, the "you're too Christian" critique, like, that is something I'm surprised you haven't gotten the critique.
Nope.
Just because, and it's probably because of the range of guests that you're
Yep.
having on. But I know that's one of the things. This isn't a question, it's just a thing I feel. But
Yeah.
I feel like there is a, be careful what I say, to not make people think I'm talking about someone I'm not. But I do see people, particularly a lot of pastors a handful of pastors who have pivoted into, like, the anti-abuse advocacy space.
Yep.
And it feels kind of just like, to me, it feels like a like covert evangelistic tool in their tool bag, to be like, let me stop my church from hemorrhaging, or let me sell a book, or let me build a platform on this, because and it's the same guys that built platforms on a billion other things. And this is the next trendy one. And with that said, it's hard for me to not feel an immediate like question mark in my head about it. Like, even when we first talked, like, if when you said, like, right when you said you're like, I'm still in it, I was like, okay, what's the angle of this show? But I think it's unfortunate, because I think there are a lot of people who are doing really good work, who are still believers, who want to clean up their own neck of the woods. But it almost feels like there's a conflict of interest sometimes, of like, I want to build up the church, but also I'm like going after, like, the organization. It's like, I think it can be easy to be, like, reticent about that. And
no, that's you. I mean, you're in the same. I'm assuming some of the same circles that I have been graciously invited, very skeptically into. But there's a lot of distrust in these communities, rightly so, because they see people like me. I didn't try to get into this. I was sort of asked, but also kind of stumbled into it myself. I wasn't like, hey, I'm going to make a name for myself, and I'm going to.
Who asked again? I'm trying to remember the origin. Like,
yeah, I was asked to produce this series.
Gotcha.
By like a think tank, an online think tank, examining Doug Wilson in Moscow.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, they approached me and asked if I'd be interested in doing this, just because they had seen some other stuff that I had posted and talked about. And I made it very clear, it's like, I have no desire to make a name for myself, nor a platform for myself. I actually like when people don't know who I am and know the people that we have on the series, which people have different views and perspectives on that. And I just, my thing is, I want people to be helped in the church, not hurt in the church. And we have a saying at Sons of Patriarchy is like, don't touch the children. If we can all agree on that,
No,
then
it's
we can work
bipartisan.
together.
Like
Yeah,
we can
yeah.
do that.
Exactly.
What? Sorry, and now I've got. I know you're like last few questions. Now
No,
my
that's
all my
those
bells are ringing.
on my end, but yeah, feel free to ask whatever you want.
How do you feel? I know you said you like being in the background, but the
Mhm.
nature of what this is,
Yeah, you
Like,
are going into a discussion
like-
that I've had many times.
like the nature of doing a podcast or doing, and again, it's funny, like the criticisms flip sides. Like when I started my show, I would like ask too long a question.
Yep.
And it would be like, shut up. We don't want to hear from you. We're listening for the guest. I would get comments
Exactly.
literally like that.
Same here.
And then a couple, like a year or two in, it was like, well, I loved hearing the guest perspective, but what do you think about it? And people build this kind of like relationship to you where it's like, well, now I know Eric. Eric talks about this. Now I know Peter. Peter talks about this. And people want to know more about, what do you think? Like, yeah, we heard what Sarah said, or we heard what Tia said, or we heard what Doug Wilson's professor said, and like, but what's your thought on it? Or where are you at? Or what have you been or where are you mentally with this? How much responsibility do you feel like you have to your audience to be like, hey, here's where Peter's at? Like, if you're having a crisis of faith, do you feel a need to be like, hey, this is what's going on right now? Or do you feel like, I have my private life, I'm just a voice that's assembling this, it is purely production type role? Because like those lines have been blurred so much for me, where like, I've been open about faith in the beginning, so now I better be open if it changes, because I don't want to be a hypocrite. It's messy, and I've had many long conversations with my wife about that topic of like, what do I owe people in my private life in these conversations?
Yeah, I've gotten both, and I've felt both, where I have had the response or the comments of, hey, Peter, you gotta keep your comments to a minimum and just be the unbiased journalist. And I was like, hey, I'm not a journalist.
Yeah.
I'm not trained in this stuff. I'm just a person who happens to know how to podcast and cares about this stuff. So there's been some response and some feedback on I need to keep my opinions at a minimum. So I've heard that a lot, because I did come out pretty strong on my own opinions.
Yeah.
On these things,
especially in those early, like that
in the early
episode,
ones, I came on pretty strong, and I got a lot of feedback for that. And a lot of that too is like, I struggle with being kind of the third party and just letting the facts be known of themselves, but also like, this affects me as just a person, some of the stuff that I'm hearing, some of the stuff that we're doing. And as a Christian, it affects me because of what's being said and what's being done in the name of God. And so, yeah, I'm gonna let my opinion know. And also, I've never once said that like, this is going to be an unbiased show. Like, we've been pretty clear about who we're going after and why we're going after them, and from what perspective we're coming after them. So there's been that, but I do struggle with putting me out there. There's like difference between my opinions and being too forward about myself, because I've been attacked is the wrong word. There's a lot of people who want to figure out like my personal life and the church that I go to and the people that I'm connected with and where I work. I get emailed, called, texted at least once a week on what church and where they can press charges of sin against me, which those are always fun. So there's because I'm in these circles, I try to keep a little bit of a distance and say, mostly for my protection, my wife's protection, for my work's protection, for my church's protection, because the church that I was at when we first started this did finally get found out and contacted. So I went the opposite direction. So I'm going to be as anonymous and as background as possible, but I'm still going to let my opinions out there. And so I get it from all sides. Where you need to talk more, let yourself be known. And I get that more from like the volunteer team is like, hey, you're the face of this. Like you need to like, this needs to be Peter Bell and Sons of Patriarchy. And I was like, I'm just not that kind of person who wants Peter Bell and Sons of Patriarchy. I want Sons of Patriarchy and the stories to be known. While also like, I have really strong opinions about these things, and I have let those be known on the series too.
Yeah.
And we will get a lot of feedback on that. People was like, this is great. Or some people were like, why are you inputting yourself in this at all? It's
Right.
like you said, it's kind of no matter where you fall on that spectrum, like you're going to get comments, and I don't know the right way of approaching some of these discussions.
Yeah. Well, and it's all taste too. Like there's people who just inherently won't like me or won't like you because for whatever arbitrary reason, or the sound of our voice or, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And
it's funny. You say sound of our voice. My accent gets made fun of, and I can't pick out where my accent comes from. Somebody said it's a unique blend of SoCal and Pacific Northwest, where I have no family from the Pacific Northwest, but supposedly, it's the Sarah who's on our team is going to make fun of me for saying this during this recording because my accent gets picked on a little bit, which is hilarious. And like I know it's there, but it's some people don't like me literally for the sound of my voice, which is fun.
It's funny. I haven't picked up anything, so I don't know. But also, I'm from California, so maybe we have the same. Maybe we have a same uniquely annoying voice.
I think so.
Yeah, I get that all the time. Like, what's funny is I used to get criticized, and I still do by a lot of pastors for having an effeminate voice, and I just assumed that was always the case. And now like I'll tell some people like I've got like more of an effeminate voice, and they're like, what? So I don't know.
I don't hear that at all too.
Verdict's out.
But people are will press the gas pedal before they say anything on that for me, because I was known before this for another podcast, and I'm big in the fitness industry, and so they're a little more worried about saying effeminate voice or effeminate features because I could beat them up.
Yeah, you need to be in the profile in the podcast artwork so they get that vibe. You're gonna lower your bad reviews. I'm so accent blind though. I worked, just a side story, I worked for a guy who was British, like very British, like grew up in England, and very strong accent, very thick accent. And I did 2 job interviews, got the job, worked there for 3 days, and then I went in his office and I said, "Can I ask you a question? Are you British?" And he's like, "Yeah, what gave it away?" But I just I just thought he had a different voice. Like I didn't pick it up as anything. So I'm a little accent blinded, but none of this is relevant to anybody listening to this. So, we can.
The last little thing I wanted to touch on.
Yeah.
For those who, when this comes on our platform, so obviously our listeners are gonna hear it. What sets? I almost said patriarchy boys. I was gonna put
spin-off.
I was gonna put them both together.
Maybe that's the name of the episode. Yeah.
If I know this is gonna be a weird thing. It's a weird thing for me to do, but why should somebody listen to Preacher Boys if they're a solid listener to Sons of Patriarchy, and they hear Eric Skwarczynski, right? Did I say that right?
Skwarczynski. Yeah, you got to drop the sin in there.
If they hear Eric from Preacher Boys and they're like, "Huh, interesting. Maybe I should listen to that." Why should somebody listen to Preacher Boys?
Over your show? I mean, I can get over. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Well, we'll say yeah. It's like, hey,
have you heard Peter's voice? You need to come over and listen. No, I'm just kidding. Please don't beat me up. No, I mean, honestly, I think my show is uniquely for some people. Like it's if you're somebody who is fascinated by fundamentalist, abuse in fundamentalist religious environments, it's probably going to be of interest. But I will say it's not for everybody because I go pretty in the weeds on some of those things. And so a lot of my show can lean toward like an inside baseball approach to fundamentalism. So I think if you were raised in it, it'll probably feel very comfortable. If you're looking for a glossary of terms on every episode, I might not be the best place. I'm trying to include some more of that as the show grows, and I have people saying, what does this mean? What does it mean when you call this person that? But I would say if you want to hear firsthand accounts from survivors who've experienced abuse in religious environments, it's a really great podcast to listen to. And I think it complements a lot of podcasts like your own that are giving you kind of like this kind of church history lesson tied into the impact, whether you're listening to like a Leaving Eden podcast, which does a really great job talking about the independent fundamental Baptist world, while also explaining it to people who have no context for it. Like, it's just one of many great shows, that I think really gives an inside look at stories that have not been talked about enough. And the one thing I said in the beginning of the show a lot, and I've been trying to say it more, the goal of Preacher Boys really is to take the microphone from people who've had it for so long and put it firmly in the hands of survivors to share their stories. And so if any of that sounds compelling, check out the show. If you don't, no hard feelings. There's a billion other shows like Sons of Patriarchy. Like I said, Leaving Eden is a fantastic show that is very adjacent to mine. There's lots of great shows to listen to, but if my voice doesn't annoy you too much, you don't think I talk too much, it's worth checking out.
Good. And the last little thing, and this is what we always end Sons of Patriarchy, at least our Thursday episodes when we're talking to survivors, because we ask them to talk directly to those who have been hurt by the church, who've been hurt by leadership, who've been hurt by others, and then leadership has either covered it up or not cared enough about it. Because this is near and dear to us, just like you said. So if you can end by talking to those, because people who listen to this and people who listen to Preacher Boys are hurt. So can you talk to those who are hurt by the church, who've been listening to this and wondering, like, is there any hope for me? How am I going to figure this stuff out? It's great listening to this, but like, I don't know who to talk to. I don't know what to do. So if you can end by talking to those who listen to this, listen to yours, listen to mine, or anybody else's who are hurting.
Yeah. I mean, the number one thing, and it's not the most encouraging piece of information, but I think it's important, is that you aren't alone. And I think that sounds pithy and cliche, and everybody says it. It's probably on the posters of crisis centers all over the country. Like, you're not alone. And I think someone said it better. My friend Kathy Durbin, who is featured in the documentary Let Us Pray, she said something to the effect of, being a survivor is like being a part of an amazing club that you wouldn't give up for anything, but nobody wants to be able to join it. And I think that perspective is really powerful. And I think what I would encourage the person who feels like they are sitting in a congregation of 100 people in a pew and they feel completely alone with their experience, not only has that experience probably happened to other people in that congregation, but there are people who have left and who have found a community that does care for them, that will protect them, that will encourage them, and will help them heal, and have built incredible lives that they never thought possible, being in a strict, authoritarian, heavily complementarian place where they have no voice. And so I just want to say, like, don't feel completely alone and find that community that can support you. And I think, honestly, like, when it comes to like my podcast, the best piece of feedback that I get when an episode goes out is every time a conversation goes out, I usually get emails or messages from people saying, "Oh my God, I thought I was the only one," or "Me too." And it's bittersweet to get those messages because it's sad that there is another person that's been through it. But it's amazing how many people have connected over similar stories. So, it can sound scary to leave everything and to leave the only environment and community that you know. But there is something out there, and there are others who will relate and will help you walk through that.
Yeah. Well, awesome, Eric. Thanks for accepting this invite and for doing the little Sons of Patriarchy and Preacher Boys collaboration.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Patriarchy Boys episode 1 just is in the can.
That's right.